Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture. My name is Ahuvia Gorin and I'm a fellow at the Polonsky Academy here at the Leer Institute in Jerusalem. Nearly 400 years after he began writing, the thought of René Descartes continues to occupy the intellectual world. The name of the French thinker, whose work spanned mathematics, physics, anatomy, and metaphysics, and who also articulated what Amos Funkenstein famously called a form of lay theology, appears again and again in contemporary scholarship. This is true both in attempts to understand his arguments and their backdrop more precisely and historically, such as Daniel Garber's Descartes' Metaphysical Physics, and in efforts to describe their limitations or failures, as in well-known works like Damasio's Descartes' Error, Waston's The Downfall of Cartesianism, or Jonathan Israel's controversial portrayal of Descartes in his studies of the Radical Enlightenment. In the history of Jewish philosophy as well, we have recently begun to see renewed interest in the connections between Jewish thought and Cartesian metaphysics. After many years in which encounters between Jewish thinkers and modern philosophers were described almost exclusively in the shadow of Spinoza, some scholars are now reconsidering the place of Cartesian thought in this history. From Isaac Cardozo's Latin Philosophia Liberia in 1673, through Rabbi Moshe Chefetz's Melechet Machshevet, through Sefer Abrit, and other works concerned with theology and natural philosophy. This trajectory extends even to Arav Amiel, the rabbi of Tel Aviv, who opened his book Linvochei HaTkufa with a version of Descartes' ontological argument. Descartes' name also appears in polemics and poetry addressing the value or the dangers of modern philosophy. The research of Oded Rabinovich from Tel Aviv University has shown a wide range of literary tropes, both sympathetic and polemical, centered on Descartes. Jewish culture offers its own examples. In a poem by Avigdor Levi, an associate of Moshe Mendelssohn, Descartes is portrayed as someone first revered as a prophet, only eventually to be found collapsed in the marketplace like a drunk. Much work still remains to be done in offering a full account of the Jewish engagement with Cartesian philosophy, whether in comparison with Spinoza or independently of him, and whether in philosophical analysis or in the broader cultural imaginaries that extend beyond philosophy proper. That task remains for another occasion. For now, we are fortunate to have a lecture that touches on and productively brings together many of these directions. An exploration of the root of Cartesian thought in concepts developed by John Scotus, a sharp account of its pretensions as well as its internal tensions, and a brief engagement with the Jewish context viewed through the lens of a Jewish thinker, Emmanuel Levinas, and his reflections on infinity. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest from Paris, Professor Arbib, who teaches at the Sorbonne, serves as the scientific secretary in the Center of Cartesian Studies there, and the director of the Bulletin Cartésien. His articles, books, and works he edited focus on metaphysics, the thoughts of Descartes and Spinoza, and his 2014 book is devoted to Levinas and ethical thought. Responding to the lecture will be another scholar who combines work in metaphysics with Jewish thought, Professor Benjamin Braun of the Department of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and a senior research fellow here at the Leer Institute. His extensive research addresses the many strands of Jewish orthodoxy from the 19th century to the present. In recent years, he also published 2 books in metaphysics, dealing with modes of thinking and proposing a new account of the foundations of rational metaphysics. After the lecture and the response, the floor will be open to questions. Without further ado, Professor Arbib, please.
Thank you. I would like to thank Professor Ahuvia Goren for his invitation to the Polonsky Academy, and I'm very delighted to have the opportunity today to share a few perspectives on Descartes' thought. I would like to thank also Professor Benjamin Braun for his response. I would like to give you an overview of the difficulties I raised in my book published in 2019 on divine infinity in Cartesian metaphysics. Divine infinity, to my mind, divine infinity disrupts Cartesian metaphysics. Such is the claim I would like to defend. It is as much a claim about infinity as it is about metaphysics, and most of all about the Cartesian position in the history of metaphysics. First of all, where in Descartes' work does the link between infinity and metaphysics appear? At least in two places. Firstly, in his letters from the spring of 1630, when he evokes for the first time the metaphysical questions. It's the first time he speaks about metaphysics. Descartes noisily announces his thesis concerning the free creation of eternal truth. It is God who posited and established the eternal truth of geometry, physics, logic, etc. Such laws are freely posited by divine decree, God being the analog of a king who posits the laws in his subject's mind. This early metaphysical thesis provides the occasion for the first mention of divine infinity. As Descartes tells us, God is an infinite and incomprehensible being. Second time, we can refer to Meditation 3 in 1641. Descartes sets out to prove the existence of God a posteriori. I have the idea of the infinite in myself, yet this infinity has an objective reality, that is a density of representation. To have an idea of the infinite is not to have an idea of a chair, a table, or something else. In order that my idea be an idea of the infinite, the content of the idea must be caused by a specific way. There must be a cause for the fact that infinity in particular is represented in my idea. And yet, I, myself, cannot be the cause of the idea of infinite because I am finite. How could I, a finite being, cause the infinity even if just represented of an idea? It is therefore necessary to posit that it is God himself, insofar as he is infinite, and that he has infinite power, who causes in me the idea of infinity. Thus is the idea of the infinite the one idea in myself that I cannot cause. The idea is singular, since it displaces me outside of myself. It is the idea in me of that which is greater than me. These are the two major occurrences of divine infinity in the Cartesian corpus: the creation of eternal truth in 1630 and the proof of the existence of God in 1641. The problem is that these two occurrences are not homogeneous. We can find a series of differences between them. First of all, let's look at the function of the idea of infinity in each case. In the case of the creation of eternal truth, God is said to be eternal because he posits the truth. He is said to be infinite because he posits the truth. That is to say, because he posits, because he institutes rationality. The infinity of God is the cause of rationality, cause of the laws, but God is beyond the finite laws as infinite. Yet, in 1641, divine infinity is not at all beyond rationality. Infinity is integrated into the demonstrative framework, and the idea of infinity relates entirely to order. We see the gap. In 1630, God is beyond all order. In 1641, divine infinity belongs to the order of the demonstration. This first gap opens up a second one. Consider the status of the idea of God in 1630. If God is the infinite being, his idea cannot be of the same order as all others. It must necessarily be singular. This is why Descartes himself recognizes that all ideas are comprehensible except this one. This idea of the infinite, therefore, by its very incomprehensibility, has a very different status as all the others. On the contrary, in 1641, in Meditation 5, at the moment of the ontological proof, the idea of God is completely analogous to all others, since the proof functions on the model of a mathematical proof. It is as intelligible as all mathematical proofs. We thus discern two lines, one line from 1630, where the idea of God is a particular idea, an idea that cannot be counted among all the others, and a line from 1641, where the idea of God is no longer and almost no longer has any distinctive mark. There is a third possible difference between the situation of 1630 and that of 1641. Consider divine infinity in 1630. Is it really about divine infinity? We may in fact have doubts this, for if God is qualified as an infinite and incomprehensible being, it is because he founds all logical and physical truths. In other words, it is because he founds the order of the comprehensible and of the finite. One indeed has the impression that is not qualified as infinite as such. God is not qualified as infinite as such, but only insofar as he creates the finite. We could call this type of infinity the infinite of distance. It is not an infinity that expresses the very being of God, but one that expresses his relation to the finite, immanent distance by creation. Infinity in 1641 is completely different. When Descartes evokes God in Meditation 3, he at once speaks of substantia infinita. Here, divine infinity qualifies the very substantiality of God. Such is what one would call the infinity of substance. Thus, in the Cartesian corpus we find an infinity of distance, 1630, opposed to an infinity of substance, 1641. There are three tensions, then, at least, in the concept of infinity. Can they be resolved? It is the question. In both cases, we are speaking of metaphysics, but each conception of metaphysics here in question is different. In 1630, metaphysics consists in thinking the establishment of the order of the thinkable. Metaphysics is precisely that which exceeds the thinkable to order, to create the truth. In 1641, instead of the concept of metaphysics, Descartes prefers the concept of metaphysica prima, without for all that renouncing a kind of equivalence between the two. Metaphysica prima is hence the study of the first notions that present themselves to the mind that philosophizes by order, which means that metaphysics designates precisely the discipline that treats the objects that enjoy an epistemological primacy. In 1630, metaphysics described God's primacy. In 1641, it designates the objects under the primacy of the mens who thinks. Facing such an internal instability of concepts, infinity and metaphysics, we should take a step back. Since the concepts taken in themselves along with their strict Cartesian resonance are not very easy to understand, the only possible option is to sidestep in direction of the long history of metaphysics. If we are able to retrace the relation between metaphysics and infinity before and perhaps after Descartes, the position of Descartes and the meaning of his concept will appear to us more clearly. To retrace the Cartesian filiation, we must first take stock of a paradox, the reversal of the infinite to its articulation in the in the 13th, 14th centuries. The history of divine infinity and its link, and the history of its link to metaphysics, is a history of stages that can be described in perhaps too cavalier a way to start, but which will allow us to grasp the entire paradox of the Cartesian situation. Let us consider first that infinity is not a divine name in the scriptures, nor did it benefit from any favorable prejudices until the 13th century. On the contrary, the notion was full of connotations of undetermination, from which the divine essence had to be preserved, since it is still understood as a peiron. From this situation, two movements emerge. First, the appearance of the infinite in the Christian West. After the condemnation of 1241, condemnation that remind that the blessed will see God in his own essence, in his very essence, the Christian West imported divine infinity from the Greek patristic to face the threat of an understanding of the divine, all too lacking in respect from the transcendence of God. This is followed over a half century by more or less avowed attempts to accommodate this divine infinity to the accepted, essentially Aristotelian theology and ontology. Such efforts as this are found in Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventura, and others. But the decisive stage is reached by Scotus, who makes infinity into the primacy name of God, the first name of God, the nomen proprium Dei. In the turn of the 13th and 14th century, the infinite has indeed become the first name of God. Now, significantly, Scotus makes another choice with regards to metaphysics. In deciding his own position in the opposition between Avicenna and Averroes, he answers the question of the objects of metaphysics. For him, metaphysics has one object, it is the concept of being. Metaphysics has now an object, conceptus antis, in the same time as Scotus makes God really infinite. We are faced with a unique situation indeed. The infinite permeates theology with full rights, just as the discipline of metaphysics is being constituted. Even better, the name of God in metaphysics is to be infinite. Thus is the nexus between metaphysics and theology woven. Why are these decisions crucial? Because they quite simply reverse the meaning of the infinite. While the infinite was initially invoked to deny the submission of God to human representation, Scotus makes the infinite the name of God that submits to the highest point of metaphysics, that is, to the highest point of representation. In 50 years, the meaning of the infinite changed, and the link between metaphysics and the infinite was established. From this situation, a question follows. How to situate Descartes in relation to the infinite metaphysics, nexus, made by Scotus? I think that Descartes perfectly assumes the Scotist situation. We can measure the Scotist situation by three decisions relating to metaphysics. First, that it be concerned with being as a concept, that is to say, that the concept should have priority over being. For in order that being be an object of science, it had to let itself be subjected to the concept. The Scottish Revolution, by promoting the ens, the being, as the object, the subject of metaphysics, introduce a disequilibrium in the heart of the conceptus entis, the concept of being, by giving the primacy to the concept over being. From this follows the primacy of representation and of intelligibility. Being is only the concept of metaphysics insofar as it makes possible the intelligibility required for representation. Scotist metaphysics is to be a metaphysics of representation or not be at all. Third, this intelligibility has as its corollary the university of the concept, since being must be represented in order to be given to the object as the object of a science. In order to enter into the fold of metaphysics, every being must validate the universal representability of being as such. It is by satisfying the beingness of representable being, object of metaphysics, that any and all beings are inscribed into metaphysics. Henceforth, every being shares representability with transcendental being. Only thereby does it give itself as a being. How does Descartes validate these three decisions? First, the primacy of the concept. As philosophia prima, Cartesian metaphysics submits being to representation, and thus to the concept. First, because it integrates the requirement of knowability into the definition of its objects. Metaphysics is the science of the first thing that one can know by philosophizing. And then because it deploys an order, not an ontic order, but an epistemological order, thereby relaying the primacy of the concept of being. The ontic is less important than the epistemological order, the epistemological being of the order. But then, since it deploys and organizes the primacy of the concept, the Cartesian philosophia prima reinforces the characteristic representation of metaphysics. How is this representation expressed? By the concept of cogitatum. Nothing is to be that is not first given to cogitatio. Ego cogito means there is a cogitatum for me. Hence is the privilege of intelligibility. Finally, the primacy of representation defines an ontology whereby being is defined as cogitatum, ut cogitatum. The primacy of the concept imposes the supremacy of the intelligible and the university of the ends reduced to an object, the cogitatum of a cogitatio. We will not be surprised, therefore, that it anticipates the definition of the ens ut intelligibile that will be the very object of metaphysics with Klauberg. Thus, Descartes validates the Scotist presupposition that defines metaphysics. First, we can also show that he submits infinity to representation. We could think that infinity is over-representation, that the idea of infinite is not an idea that can be represented to the ego as a cogitatum. I think it's wrong. First, because this idea of infinite can satisfy philosophia prima, because it is submitted to the ego. First quotation, Descartes says that we can have no knowledge of things if not by the ideas that we conceive of them. Yet it goes without saying that there are no ideas except for an ego cogito. The idea is even defined by such an ordination. Here, the disqualification of eventual differences between the ways of conceiving reveals the only point in common between the different types of ideas. They all be the cogitationes of an ego, and thus they are submitted to it. The idea of infinite is highly representable because it is highly given to the ego. Descartes adds a second argument. The idea of the infinite belongs to a particular type of ideas, those that are tamquam imagines rerum, as the images of things, by virtue of their realitas objectiva. What is realitas objectiva? Objective reality. Descartes says, by the objective reality of an idea, I understand the entity or the being of the represented thing, insofar as this entity is in the idea. Objective reality is the being of the represented thing as represented. The idea holds the thing itself within itself, though in an ontologically represented. The idea holds the thing itself within itself, though in an ontologically degraded way. Yet the idea infinity can very well be decomposed into realitas formalis and realitas objectiva. It is in fact on the realitas objectiva that the proof, the a posteriori proof, is to be grounded. Thus the idea of the infinite, as any idea, represents, and one may not contest this without compromising the integrity of the method of meditation 3. The second clue of the privilege of representation is the retreat of incomprehensibility in favor of intelligibility. It is often said that incomprehensibility is at the heart of meditation 3. We should not be so sure. In meditation 3, the a posteriori proof has an effect already been expressed formally in its integrity, and with no mention of incomprehensibility when this latter term first makes its appearance. One must inquire into the matter even more closely in order to see that incomprehensibility does not so much ground the proof as it, on the contrary, threatens it. I read Descartes, nec obstat quod non comprehendam infinitum. That means it is not an objection that I can't understand infinitum. Then we can see here that the incomprehensibility of the idea of infinite is an objection to the proof. Why? Because for the proof to work, we need to have the idea, and this idea must be intelligible. If this idea were incomprehensible, the proof couldn't work. That's why the idea is a very clear and distinct idea. By compromising the possibility that I have the idea of the infinite, incomprehensibility would have suspended the possibility of the proof, since the latter is only valid if the idea of the infinite gives itself in representation, that is, provides an objective reality, the amplitude of which reveals the deficiency of my causal power. Thus, by the submission to representation and by the retreat of incomprehensibility, does Cartesian infinity to Scotus. Cartesian infinity belongs to a Scotist history. But this Cartesian dependence on Scottish metaphysics goes deeper. It becomes a very depth on the ontological field. For if Descartes was able to accord to God a concept that for Aristotle designated undetermination itself, this is first because Scotus had thematically orchestrated the exact inversion of the Aristotelian determinations of the infinite. Everybody knows that Descartes' infinity, as conceived by Descartes, contradicts Aristotelian infinity. Three formulas would suffice to show it. First, the definition of the infinite as actu infinitum ut nihil eius perfectioni adit possit. Infinite, to which nothing could be added. This inverses very exactly the Aristotelian formula. In fact, says Aristotle, not that outside of which there is nothing, but that outside of which there is always something, that is the infinite. That is why Descartes sees a totally in infinity that Aristotle does not allow. Next, while Aristotelian infinity is only in potentiality, Cartesian infinity is infinity in actuality. God is infinity, re ipsa infinite in se habere, since he is actu infinitum. Finally, the dictum of Aristotle that infinity does not encompass but is encompassed insofar as it is infinite finds its literal contradiction in the formula non tam capere quam capi from the first responsionists. Because Cartesian infinity is a totality of perfection, it encompasses, contrary to Aristotelian infinity, that because always unfinished cannot but be encompassed. We could thus multiply the confrontations term by term. All would establish without dispute that Descartes precisely and literally invert the Aristotelian formulations in order to give infinity the divine perfection. But thereby, Descartes merely gives expression to mutations that were in process well before him, and in Scotus in particular. The fifth and sixth questions of the Quodlibet from Scotus are revealing in this regard. Scotus there straightway posits that formaliter infinitum est perfectio simpliciter. Scotus posits that infinitum equals perfectio. The closeness to Descartes could be established by the conception of infinity in actuality, the conception of infinity as a mode, and the analogical quantification of the entities, but I will not be more specific on this point. The Cartesian situation with regard to infinity, thus, seems rigorously Scotist. Such is the first result of my inquiry. And yet it is true that the position of infinity is unstable in the Cartesian corpus. Perhaps this instability translates into its relation to the metaphysical tradition. The impossibility of a solely and rigorously substantialist interpretation of divine infinity testifies to such an upheaval. For this, I will give three reasons. The priority of divine infinity over substantiality, the difficulties born in the relations between the finite and the infinite, and the status of the causa sui. First, the a posteriori proof of meditation 3, in effect, gives prevalence to infinity over all other determinations, and first of all over the central determination, that is substantiality. The crucial point of my argument here consists in distinguishing two facts. First, the fact that God is a substance, which is insufficient to prove the existence of God, because the idea of substance could well originate from the fact that I myself am a substance. And the second series of facts that the divine substance is infinite. The idea of infinite substance cannot originate in me, who am finite, but only in a substance that is indeed infinite. In this line of reasoning, substantiality plays no role at all. It does, as such, not allow us to see the relation under which the impotence of the ego is revealed. As substance, I can cause my idea of divine substance. substantiality itself, because it can equally be situated in the ego as in the objective reality of the idea, could not bring into play any excess, any overpowering of our capacity of explanation, which results solely from the distance between the finite and the infinite. And the proof is thus not grounded on substantiality, but on infinity. The gap between the ego and God does not reside in their relation to substantiality, but on the disproportion between the infinity of God and the finitude of man. The second reason lies in the sufficient elaboration of the relationships between God and the rest of being. The first model imposes a caesura between finite and infinite. This model is born from the creation of eternal truth in 1630. The finite is created, infinity is uncreated. Creation distinguished the real and finite, creation distinguished the finite and the infinite, toto coelo. The caesura is equally found in 1641. It is the proof, the a posteriori proof, which is based on the exceptionality of the idea of infinite. So there is a caesura between finite and infinity. But to this first model, another is superadded, the distinction between res cogitans and res extensa. Between the two, res cogitans, mind, and space, no passage is possible, since it is impossible to conceive of the existence of a substance without knowing if it is either cogitans or extensa. The space to extent of thought as principal attributes consists the essence of substance and give it to our sight, even if no community can be contemplated between the res extensa and the res cogitans. That is why one can, in this configuration, admit a community between God and the ego. Both of them are res cogitantes, by opposition to res extensa. There are Cartesian declarations that go in this direction and suggest an university between the mens and God under the relation of cogitatio. Here, there is a caesura not between the finite and the infinite, but between res extensa, res cogitans. The infinite, God, and the ego are in the same side. There are two models, a horizontal caesura with a finite and infinite equivocity, a vertical caesura with a res cogitans, res extensa equivocity, and thus a university between God and the ego. To these two models, perhaps we could add a monistic temptation, according to which God would confiscate all the being. Descartes said that the idea of God, the idea of infinity comprehending all being, it is the line which goes to Spinoza. So we can see now that the model of the ontology of Descartes is not completely satisfying. The same fragility is found in the concept of causa sui, and we know that the causa sui is the concept of metaphysics, as Heidegger said. Consider the first responsionist. Why is God causa sui? Because an objector to Descartes, Caterus, refused to admit the possibility of the ego's self-sufficiency. In response, Descartes admits that an entity can be cause of itself, and indeed goes on to affirm that God has this capacity on two accounts: first, of his infinite power, and then because there is nothing of which we may not ask the cause. Two things must be noted. On the one hand, it is the infinity of divine power that incites one to think about a God that is cause of itself. On the other hand, thought remains a unique concept because applicable to God alone. The causa sui gives itself as the answer to a general question of anything we may ask whether it exists. Completely other is the procedure of the fourth responsiones. Descartes entitles himself to a reformulation of the question. God is causa sui, not in response to the question why God exists, that may be asked regarding every being, but in response to the question, what is the cause of its existence, and if it does not have a cause, why? In other words, the causa sui gives the reason for the absence of cause, of the cause of God's existence. The causa sui is no longer at all the answer of the demand for a cause. It is the reason for the absence of a cause. We see very well that the infinite is that which subjects God to the demand for a cause and makes of the infinite a divine name in full right in the first responsiones, and that which exempts him from a causality too rigidly understood in the fourth responsiones. Here we are in possession of several aporias which reveal the crisis with which the infinite opens up in Cartesian metaphysics. Let's follow this way. Let's admit that the crisis that Descartes puts a crisis into metaphysics, and let's show that we can follow this direction. We could risk a non-metaphysical interpretation of the infinite, which displaces and downgrades the question of being. The analysis of Emmanuel Levinas on Meditation 3 put us on the path of such an interpretative reversal. The Meditation 3 unfolds a paradox. It opens with the dependence of every idea towards God, but the proof of the existence of God ends with the ego's dependence on the idea of infinity. We can guess the reversal of metaphysics which this statement makes possible. We have shown that metaphysics requires that ideas be first referred to the bearer, the ego, and therefore be subject to it. Now, does the dependence of the ego on the idea of the infinite incline us to recognize in the idea of infinity a proper regime? Everything works as if the ego commanded the idea that would paradoxically organize his own defection, as if the ego divested himself of his own primacy over his cogitationes in favor of one of them. This inversion of priority constitutes the paradox of the idea of the infinite. As an idea, the infinite needs the ego, which is its support, but as an idea of infinity, it is presupposed by the ego himself. This paradox is complicated by a second one, namely Descartes' justification for this reversal of priority. I read the text. How could it be possible that I should know that I doubt and desire, that is, that I'm missing something and that I'm not perfect, if I had none in me the idea of a being more perfect than mine, by the comparison of which I should know the defects of my nature? End of quote. The priority of the infinite is therefore justified by means of a comparison. But is this concept of comparison adequate to the situation. We may doubt. What is a comparison? This is a technical concept that the réguler ad directionem genii shed light on. Rule 14 and already Rule 6 define the comparison as a ratio between magnitudes in a polynomial expression. For example, the ratio between known magnitudes and an unknown magnitude enables the unknown to be deduced. The comparison relates quantities and, by reduction, makes possible to define the unknown term. But can we mobilize this concept of comparison to translate the relations between the finite and the infinite? Descartes affirms this, but not without an aporia. The application of the comparison requires a natura communis, ensuring the homogeneity of terms compared and to which the terms are linked by a ratio of participatio. Now, is such a natura common to the finite and the infinite to be found in the text of Meditation 3? No, obviously, since the absence of any univocity between the determination of the finite and the infinite compromises the possibility of any natura communis among them. Meditation 3 indicates a reversal which the methodical concept of comparison does not allow to understand, as if this reversal reversed as much metaphysics as the method itself. Understanding the relation of the finite to infinity therefore requires deserting the Cartesian method and the categories of ontology. The anteriority of the idea of infinity is a sui generis anteriority which cannot be approached by or commented by the method. The important reversals of the Cartesian metaphysical scheme, of which I would like to give 3 proofs: the end of the substantiality of the ego, the inadequacy of the scholastic lexicon of infinity, the distinction between innatity and causality. I will be short on these points. First evidence, the end of substantiality of the ego and the promotion of his status of image of God. At the end of Meditation 3, the ego becomes not a substance but the image of God, and the image cannot be a substance. So Descartes leaves the question of metaphysics for another direction, perhaps a theological direction. Second proof, the inadequacy of ontological concepts of objective and formal reality. For example, many people say that the idea of infinity has an infinite realitas objectiva, objective reality. But when we read closely the text, we can see that the objective reality of the idea of infinity is not infinite, because Descartes cannot say that objective reality is infinite. That means that the ontological concept of realitas objectiva does not fit to the scheme of his purpose. And the third proof is the difference between innatity and causality. At the end of Meditation 3, Descartes asks, "Now, I know that God is the cause of my idea, but where does this idea come from?" We can see that the question of the cause is not the same question as where does the idea come from. And he answers that this idea was put in myself by God. It is an innate idea. We can see that the causality and innatity are not the same notion. Descartes leaves the question of causality. So Descartes leaves substantiality from he removes substantiality from the ego. He takes off the questions of realitas objectiva, and he leaves the question of causality. three very important concepts of metaphysics. I started my paper dwelling on the tensions of the concept of infinity. I finish it on the tensions that lie in the heart of the subjectivity, at the very heart of the ego. This tension finally clarifies the link between the metaphysics of the letters of 1630 and that of Meditations 3 and 5. The idea of infinity is at the same time an idea of the foundation that goes beyond reality and the idea that integrates itself with rationality to demonstrate this foundation. Thus, in the heart of the divine infinity, attention is all the more powerful and unbearable as Descartes strangely hid it. His metaphysics acquires a kind of internal duality which Descartes does not look aware of. The fact that Descartes contributed to the submission of the infinite to the unfolding of metaphysics does not prevent him from associating in the same time a metaphysical determination and a non-metaphysical determination of God. With Scotus, God entered into metaphysics as infinite. With Levinas, he came out of metaphysics, still as infinite. This paradox, it was to Descartes to deploy it maximally. Descartes announces Levinas and the reversion of metaphysics, the end of metaphysics, but he announces the end of metaphysics after assuming all the supposition, the claims of Duns Scotus, who was the first and the most important metaphysician in medieval ages. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We've just heard the illuminating lecture, profound lecture by Professor Dan Arbib, which examined the developments of Descartes' thought, focusing on the introduction of the concept of divine infinity into his philosophical system, and the metaphysical crisis that emerged from this move, and the consequent need for new metaphysics and beyond. Before I proceed, I wish to thank Professor Arbib for his paper and Dr. Ovia Goren for initiating this meeting. In my remarks, I would like to address several issues raised in the lecture, concentrating on three interconnected matters. One is the introduction of infinity into Descartes' philosophy as part of a broader tendency, familiar from the Middle Ages and the early modern period, to incorporate non-rational or rationally problematic concepts into scientific and philosophical systems. Two, the close linkage between infinity and perfection, which flourished in the period in this period in philosophy and theology alike, both Jewish and Christian, and continued into the 18th century. Three, the implications of these developments for our understanding of paradox and rationality in philosophy and the sciences on the whole. As a number of influential scholars, among them Alexander Poiret, Ernst Cassirer, and Francis Yates, have argued, modern European science achieved its decisive breakthroughs, in part because of its openness to concepts that had previously been regarded as non-rational, or at least as threatening to rational coherence. These concepts are often imported from Hermetic, mystical, or theological traditions. Among these traditions is Kabbalah, on which I shall focus in what follows. But let us first begin by clarifying what is at stake. Aristotelian science presents itself as highly rational. Precisely for this reason, however, it refuses to acknowledge several concepts that today appear almost self-evident, but then were considered irrational. The existence of empty space, the number zero, and actual infinity. Instead, it accepts only potential infinity. Indeed, the Aristotelian rejection of zero, for example, is grounded in common sense ontology. Zero is nothing, and nothing cannot be said to exist. All numbers belong to the realm of being, and what has no being cannot be counted among them. Although certain uses of zero were already known in the ancient world, its full incorporation into mathematics is usually associated with Fibonacci in the 13th century. The reason is straightforward. Mathematical practice eventually discovered that it could not advance without introducing zero into the number line, not just speaking about it abstractly, but designating it formally. A similar logic applies to infinity. For Aristotle, infinity exists only in potential, never in actuality. We can always proceed further along the number line, yet at every point we encounter only a finite number. Infinity as such is never reached. It remains an unending process rather than an attained entity. This position appears eminently reasonable and accords well with the mathematical intuition. Indeed, zero and infinity would later become the central axis of advanced mathematics. The third rejected concept is empty space. I'll say later why it's integrated. Empty space here not as a mathematical abstraction, but as a physical reality. While early atomists such as Democritus affirmed the existence of void between the atoms, Aristotle famously denied the existence of empty space. Even medieval Aristotelian philosophers who adopted atomistic theories were unwilling to accept an actual void, speaking at most of a void in potentiality. An actual void appeared irrational to Aristotle because his conception of causality relied on contact between objects. One object acts upon another through the continuous physical interaction. A void would interrupt this causal chain, creating a block of nothingness in between. Since nothingness is not being, it cannot participate in the causality or sustain the order of nature. This is also why Descartes later adopted the vortex theory, which likewise denied the existence of empty space. Once again, Aristotelian thinkers resorted to the language of potentiality. Thus, the rejection of zero, actual infinity, and actual void all appear at first glance to be essentially rational positions. Modern science, however, adopted precisely these concepts in order to solve theoretical and empirical problems. Mathematics soon discovered that zero and infinity, while indispensable, also generate paradoxes. We're all familiar with the paradox of zero divided by zero. According to one rule, zero divided by any number is zero. According to another, any number divided by zero is infinity. And according to a third rule, any number divided by itself is 1. Similar paradoxes arise with infinity divided by infinity, among others. At first sight, such paradoxes seem to undermine the rationality of modern scientific systems and might tempt us to return to the apparent clarity of Aristotelian science. Why then did this not happen? There are two reasons, two answers. First, the abandonment of Aristotelian science was not an act of intellectual adventurism, but a response to genuine problems arising both within mathematics and within empirical sciences, problems that could not be resolved without these new concepts. Second, Aristotelian science itself is not free of paradox. Now, one particularly relevant paradox concerns potential infinity. Aristotle spoke about potential, not actual infinity. Potential infinity is also paradoxical. The claim that infinity exists only potentially and never actually appears elegant, yet it conflicts with Aristotle's own conception of potentiality and actuality. Potentiality for Aristotle is capacity that can be actualized, a movement toward fulfillment of perfection. To posit something that is necessarily and eternally in potentiality and never is actual is to introduce the contradiction, a possibility that can never be realized. This implies that a significant aspect of reality can never reach its telos or perfection, a conclusion that sits uneasily with the Aristotelian worldview. A similar difficulty arises with the notion of void, existing only in potentiality. If a potentiality can never be actualized, it ceases to be potential in any meaningful sense and becomes instead a necessity of non-realization. We thus find ourselves in a dilemma. Both the Aristotelian framework and the modern scientific framework that came to replace it lead to paradoxes. These problems, however, troubled thinkers in mystical traditions far less. In many such traditions, infinity was regarded as a fundamental attribute of God. I will focus here on Jewish Kabbalah. Already in one of the earliest texts of Jewish mysticism, Sefer Yetzirah, we encounter the phrase, I quote, 10 sfirot blima, 10 whose measure has no end. While these sfirot are often described as numbers, the text makes clear that what is at stake is not merely numerical, but spatial infinity. In Sefer HaBahir, commonly dated to the 11th or 12th century, but containing earlier materials, a heavenly realm is known as, quote, holy palace. The holy palace is compared to divine thought. Thought has no end or limit. I quote, yes, thought has no end or limit, and so this place has no end or limit. Infinity is thus presented not as a problem, but as a defining feature of the divine. Professor Arbib noted that in late medieval scholastic philosophy, infinity eventually came to be regarded as an attribute of God, culminating in Duns Scotus' identification of infinity as the nomen proprium Dei, the proper name of God. What is striking is that Kabbalah articulates a remarkably similar position more than a century earlier. In Kabbalistic literature, the hidden, unemanated, primary stratum of divinity is called Ein Sof, the infinite. Not merely described as infinite, but is named as such, nomen proprium Dei. Rabbi Azriel of Gerona, writing in the 12th century, clearly distinguishes between Ein Sof and the emanated Sfirot, and explicitly states that the unlimited divine stratum is called Ein Sof, is called the infinite. There is no apologetic hesitation here. Infinity appears as self-evident theological concept. Now, the root of the difference between Aristotle and the Kabbalists lies in their starting points. Aristotle begins with a finite natural world, making the transition to infinity problematic. To the contrary, the Kabbalists begin with infinity itself. And so the transition to finitude is their central problem. Now, I guess you will now think to yourself, wow, it's a nice insight, so let's adopt it in rational philosophy, start with the infinite and go from it to the finite. So someone who already preceded you in that, and his name is Baruch Spinoza. The idea was taken. This problem receives its most developed formulation in the doctrine of Tzimtzum, articulated by Rabbi Yitzchak Luria the Ari in 16th century Safed. According to this doctrine, Ein Sof originally filled all reality, but in order for emanation to occur, to make room for emanation, it had to create within itself a void space, Chalal HaPanui, into which the divine lights could flow. Kabbalah thus recognizes an actual void, not merely a potential one, without apology. What is especially striking is that the Ari does not seem troubled either by the scientific implications of the natural void or by the theological scandal that it appears to entail. Although Kabbalistic doctrine affirms that there is no place devoid of him, the solution proposed by his disciple is that residual trace, the Rashimu, remains within the void. It is worth noting that the idea of contraction, Tzimtzum, and emptiness already appears in the embryonic form, in Rabbi Azriel, whom I mentioned before, who writes, as I said before, in 12th century, that divine light surrounds the world, but the creation required the emergence of emptiness, since, I quote, the empty place establishes everybody and serves as the foundation of all structure. The role of Kabbalah in shaping the conceptual foundation of early modern science has been studied for several decades and is receiving increasing attention today, by Ove among others. In this context, I wish to emphasize the importance of a figure who, in my view, has not yet received the attention it deserves, Francesco Patrizzi da Cherso, one of the major intellectuals of Italian Renaissance. Patrizzi was a sharp critic of Aristotelian science, probably the first European thinker to affirm the existence of actual independent vacuum, and an important innovator in discussions of infinity. Crucially for our purposes, he also displayed a pronounced interest in Kabbalah. I could even suggest very cautiously the possibility of a personal encounter between Patrizzi and the particular Kabbalist who appears, at least circumstantially, in the same place at the same time during a certain stage of his life, but this will remain for another discussion. As we heard in Professor Arbib's lecture, Descartes integrates the concept of infinity into a broader discussion of perfection. Perfection for Descartes cannot be complete unless it is infinite. In this respect, Descartes stands in a highly influential as a highly influential figure within the broader early modern tendency toward an intensified engagement with the concept of perfection. Perfection, of course, has a long occupied central place in philosophy and theology, from Plato's theory of ideas to Aristotle's notion of telos, and had become deeply embedded in theological discourse. Yet, the 16th century witnesses a particularly systematic and multifaceted treatment of perfection. It is therefore unsurprising that Descartes reformulates the ontological proof in these terms. As whereas Anselm spoke of, I quote, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, Descartes speaks of, I quote again, a being that is absolutely perfect. Even though, as we heard, he preserves Anselm's formulation elsewhere. You noted in the draft you sent me that he also uses Anselm's formulation elsewhere. Let me add parenthetically that the flourishing of political, that's really in brackets, the flourishing of political utopias, another phenomenon that begins in the 16th century, may also be connected to the rising power of the concept of perfection. It is probably no coincidence that Patrizzi, alongside his work on infinity and the vacuum, also authored a political utopia. This development did not bypass Kabbalah. The intensely spatial and temporal descriptions of Tzimtzum in Lurianic Kabbalah caused discomfort among Kabbalists committed to the doctrine that Ein Sof transcends all spatial and temporal determination. In response, some thinkers moved toward allegorical interpretations of the Tzimtzum. The figure generally regarded as pioneering in this approach is the Spanish, Italian, Dutch Kabbalist Rabbi Avraham Cohen Herrera of the 16th and 17th century, Avraham Cohen Herrera, an older contemporary of Descartes. Herrera rejected the idea that Ein Sof literally occupies space, then withdrew from it. For him, Ein Sof is not spatial in infinity, but infinite perfection. Accordingly, the act of making room within the divine becomes in him the act of making room for the possibility of an imperfect world. At this point, however, Herrera encounters what I would call the paradox of perfection, and it goes like following. A perfect being includes everything that lacks nothing, right? Includes everything, lacks nothing, it's perfect. Yet Ein Sof emanates a finite and deficient world. How is this possible? Either the world is given from within Ein Sof, or it is given from something outside it. If it is given from within, then deficiency must already exist within Ein Sof. Deficiency within Ein Sof. And that compromises divine perfection. If it is given from without, from the outside, there is something that Ein Sof does not include, again compromising his perfection. Herrera's solution, maybe resort is the right word here, is a return to the Aristotelian distinction between potentiality and actuality. The total perfection attributed to Ein Sof prior to the emanation refers to Ein Sof in potentiality, that is, as it would be had the finite world not been created. In actuality, however, the finite and deficient world exists within God and is emanated from him. It is important to stress that actuality in Aristotelian terms is, of course, the stronger and more real state, and it is within God. This is in the actual world. Herrera lived partly contemporaneously with Descartes and preceded him. I am not claiming that Descartes was influenced by Herrera, despite the fact that Descartes served as a soldier in Amsterdam around the time Herrera settled there. Just almost the same year. Rather, I suggest that both thinkers were immersed in a shared intellectual climate in which infinity was readily translated into infinite perfection, and in which the paradoxes of this translation were clearly perceived. According to Prof. Arbib, Descartes adopted several strategies to cope with these difficulties. One of them is the subjective turn embodied in this so-called anthropological proof. Instead of addressing perfection itself, Descartes turns to the idea of perfection that as it appears in the human mind, in the ego. In doing so, Professor Arbib argues Descartes exposes the crisis into which metaphysics has fallen as a result of the scholastic paradoxes. This turn cannot pass very smoothly. Within classical rationalism, we can identify a tacit premise that I call the principle of logical ontological dependence. Logical dependence implies ontological dependence. If the proof of God's perfection depends on the thinking self that conceives it, then, according to this principle, then the existence is itself seems to proceed from the subject, from the ego to God, rendering God dependent on the subject, a deeply troubling paradox. It is worth noting, however, that most contemporary Descartes scholars agree that the ontological and anthropological proofs are in fact two separate arguments, but a single entangled proof. Are not two separate arguments, but a single entangled proof. This entanglement may have been indeed intended to mitigate the danger of placing the subject in the point of origin. Another strategy discussed by Professor Arbib is Descartes' attempt to link the human subject, the ego, with the divine subject. We heard in the draft you sent me, we heard about Descartes' letter dated February 1, 1647, where he defines God as a kind of res cogitans, similar in essence to the thinking self. I quote, "A mind or a thinking thing in which the nature of our soul bears some resemblance to his, to God's." A similar formulation appears in the Principles of Philosophy, Article 54. As Professor Arbib correctly observed, this move again limits divine perfection, as if God is a mind, he is not matter, and thus appears partial and finite. One might add that thought can plausibly be regarded as more infinite than matter, and therefore Descartes prefers to describe God as thought. As we've seen, early Kabbalistic sources such as the Bahir already describe thought as having no end. Yet, as long as anything remains outside that infinity, matter, it remains limited, and thus not truly infinite. We also heard that in a later letter of April 23, 1649, Descartes reverses course and describes God as comprehending all being. At this point, the paradoxes of his system bring him close to a pantheistic position, almost as an invitation to someone who would carry the logic of its radical conclusion, Spinoza. Descartes' discussions of causa sui, we heard that, as presented by Professor Arbib, clearly point to this direction. Yet pantheism, which many, myself included, regard as a form of atheism, stands in sharp contradiction to the theistic system that Descartes sought to build. Here, too, contradiction remained unresolved. Despite these tensions, the concept of perfection continued to develop after Descartes. Thinkers like Fenelon, Malebranche, and Leibniz grounded their conceptions of God in perfection and infinity, sometimes even basing their proofs of God's existence on these notions. In Kabbalah, the concept flourished as well, notably in the writings of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Ramchal, in the early 18th century. By contrast, the concept became the object of sharp criticism and bitter mockery in the work of Jean Méliès, the atheist materialist whose testament contains pointed polemics against Descartes and the Cartesians. Leer, too, is a thinker who deserves far more attention, but that too is, I'm afraid, that too must remain beyond the scope of today's discussion. To conclude, I would like to step back from the individual thinkers we have surveyed and offer a more general reflection on the place of paradoxes within rational systems. As we have seen, early modern thinkers struggle, often painfully, with the paradoxes generated by the notions of infinity and infinite perfection. I would suggest that we can describe the struggle, then as now, as a kind of horror paradoxorum, a fear of paradoxes analogous to the well-known horror vacui, the fear of the void. Paradoxes are typically perceived as threats to the integrity of rational systems, whether philosophical or scientific. They're often taken to signal a fatal flaw, something that undermines the validity of the entire system and threatens to bring it crashing down. A well-known example is Frege's reaction to Russell's paradox. Upon learning of it, Frege was prepared to abandon his entire logical calculus. This response rests on a strong assumption, namely that the rational system must be flawless, gapless, and free of internal tension. In my view, this assumption is partly misguided, and the conclusions drawn from it are therefore unwarranted. I would propose a different approach. Rational systems should indeed be consistent and complete where they are actually applied. But when they encounter paradoxes, the paradoxes should be locally suspended rather than globally rejected or collapsing the entire system. After all, the paradoxes of zero divided by zero and infinity divided by infinity do not compel us to abandon elementary arithmetic. We do not conclude that now we can no longer add 2 and 3 or divide 7 by 7, simply because certain operations generate contradictions at the margins of the system. It may rightly be objected that this is a pragmatist move. I admit. It does not demand it does not demand from a rational system an all-encompassing purity. Instead, it demands that the system work. And the primary test must meet, that it must meet precisely is that it must work. This is the pragmatist criterion of truth, especially when we are dealing not with isolated propositions, but large-scale theoretical frameworks. Yet, this pragmatism is limited and residual. It is not meant to replace rigorous rational grounding, but to serve as a fallback option when maximalist demands become destructive. When strict rational justification fails, yet sound intuition tells us that abandoning the entire system would be unreasonable, pragmatism may function as a second-best support. This is particularly compelling in situations such as those we examined earlier, where we face genuine dilemma, and where both horns lead to paradox. Yes, let's recall, yes, it's both Aristotelian and modern science calls paradoxes. In such cases, we are forced to choose the horn that works better. Otherwise, we would all become Buridan's donkeys. Before resigning ourselves entirely to the pragmatist concession, however, I would like to suggest one further line of thought. Instead of attempting to eliminate paradoxes, we may try to identify what I would call the regularity of the irregularities, the regularity within the paradoxes. If we collect the paradoxes that arise within a given system, say mathematics, we may not succeed in fully integrating them into the system as a whole, yet we may well discover that the paradoxes themselves display an internal order. In this respect, one may recall another early modern thinker, the Maharal of Prague, who speaks of two distinct orders, the order of governing nature and the special order governing miracles. That is, the breaches of natural order. Order of nature and order of the breaches of nature of miracle. Rationality, at its core, is a matter of order and regularity. And if we can uncover a regularity even in the breaches of regularity, this too would amount to a form of rationality. regularity, as rationality. At a later stage, we might even aspire to a higher principle capable of unifying the rationality of the ordinary system with that of its exceptions, and thus perhaps arrived at a more comprehensive conception of rationality itself. Thank you all.
Thank you both for these wonderful papers. The floor is now open if someone has any question or remark. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, can we say that Descartes' system was deistic?
Theistic. TH, yes. Not deistic, no, certainly not.
And because sometimes philosophers write that there are pre-deistic elements.
In Descartes, Dan is the expert, I don't know such elements.
Even Jonathan Israel doesn't really go that way. He describes Descartes as like opening a door and not stepping through it, or something like that, as kinds of, there's like some predetermination of some ideas, but nothing really that turns into these.
And the second question, from the just myself and also from fellow philosophers. So actually, the world becomes intelligible for us, for our logical. Here a question arises.
Can you raise your voice, please? Mentioned that our cogito is somehow close to God's cogito, and that's why the created world is intelligible for us, right? Yeah. Not only that, but this is his kind of definition of God as a kind of res cogitans similar to us, as he says. Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
Say a bit more about how revolutionary step of which Descartes made enabled science, our modern science.
Professor, we will answer that.
The link between Descartes and modern science?
How he enabled its emergence.
Yes. The question of infinity in Descartes.
Question for the live stream. Repeat your question to the microphone.
Oh, so I will repeat the question. You're asking how did Descartes opened up parts of the scientific revolution? Yeah.
Okay.
What in his thought enabled moderns again?
Two points. The first is that for Descartes, infinity, divine infinity, has no link with scientific revolution, because he says that the concept which is adequate to science is not infinity, but indefinity. Indefinity is the concept of what we think, but what we cannot give an end to. You think of space, for example, and you can think of space, you can add space to space to space with no end. This is indefinity. The same thing for numbers. It's the same thing for the division of corpora of special objects of space, etc. So that's why he does not have the same concept for science, indefinity, and metaphysics, infinite. So there is no link between God and the infinite object like the universe, etc. This is the first point. The second point is the role, the function of metaphysics for science, for Descartes. For him, metaphysics is the ground of science. Why? Because God creates the truth, so there could not be any truth if God had not created it. Second point, God says the truth. He is veras. So when I think 2 plus 2 equal 4, I'm sure that there is not a misleading God who is trying to always deceiving me. That's why metaphysics is necessary to science. And he says that we can do mathematics if we don't have a God who is the ground on which the science can be founded.
Yes, David.
Professor Arbib, thank you. Do you think perhaps, even though Descartes' infinite may not be as infinite compared to Levinas, comparing it to, for example, Spinoza's understanding of perfection still leaves the excess of God's free will, or something that would have allowed him to act in an arbitrary manner, or a manner at least that is only subjected to moral constraints and not, like he won't lie to us not because he cannot, because lies cannot come from him, but because he is good. He wouldn't do it to us.
In Descartes, God does not lie, not only because he's good, but because when we lie, it is the proof that we have no enough power to tell the truth. When we are lying, it's because we have to face difficulties. So God has enough power to tell the truth. But the link between Descartes, Spinoza, and Levinas, I think that Spinoza goes on to the ontological direction. It was in Descartes, but it was just one part of Descartes. For example, the concept of perfection in Descartes is an ontological concept. It is the degree of being. And in Spinoza, God has the all being, so he has all the degrees of being, and that's why he is infinite, because he is perfect. For Levinas, to be perfect or to be infinite is something else. It is precisely not being, otherwise than being. So it is something else, something totally different. But what is interesting here is that Levinas founds his own concept of infinity in Descartes and in the paradox of meditation 3. That is, there are passages in which Descartes is not an ontological thinker, but a thinker of the excess on ontology. That's why I can say that there are two sides in meditation 3, two sides in Descartes. One side who is rooted in Duns Scotus and goes to Spinoza, the side of metaphysics, of ontology, and the other side which goes to Levinas, and which is a thought of excess, who goes to phenomenology, to the inversion of the primacy, etc. The ego is not the first; it is second, etc. And I think this is the interest of Descartes' position here.
Anyone else? Yes, please.
Thanks for the talk. So I guess I have one historical question and one philosophical question. The historical question has to do with does Descartes have any mathematical or even very crude mathematical notion of infinity? Because when us contemporaries hear the word infinity, it's almost exclusively mathematical, right? So because that's and it's there's this notion of infinity that starting with Kant, we have already like tend the notion, right? So it's no longer a mystery, and there's like well-defined mathematical way of thinking about how infinity works. Whereas like apparently that's not what Descartes has in mind when he has the word infinity, which seems to me more like the word perfection or lack of confinement or some kind of perfect degree of self-dependence, which is not like needing anything from elsewhere or without. And I'm just curious, like, because those two ideas, they don't naturally converge, right? Because like you have this mathematical notion of infinity, which we might or might not be able to visualize. Then you have this theological notion of infinity, which has to do with dependence, perfection, whatever. Then I just wonder, like did Descartes ever like entertain any mathematical aspect of the notion, or is it totally like not there when he's making something like the ontological argument in meditation? That's the historical question. Then I was just curious for the philosophical question that whether Descartes has any philosophical reason for thinking that mathematical truth can be contingent, because like apparently he's a voluntarist when it comes to not only physical truth but mathematical truth as well. That's very radical. And I'm always like puzzled like whether he has any, I don't know, just non theological reason for thinking that, let's say, 2 plus 2 can equal 5 or whatever, right? So like mathematical truth could be otherwise. I mean, other than his epistemology, right? So other than saying that what we can err when we make calculations, sure, but that doesn't mean that mathematics can be otherwise, right? So just that's the philosophical aspect.
So, two questions. The first about the first question, in his mathematics, Descartes does not use the concept of infinity. It's not his way of doing mathematics. The question of mathematics for him is how to solve questions, determined questions. The question of infinity in mathematics is not his point. It will be the point of Leibniz. That's why Descartes does not go to the yeah, it does not go to, because it's not his point. The second, I think that for him, the concept of infinite in Leibniz, for example, would be linked to the Aristotelian concept. That is, not only potential, but which is potential, but Aristotle says day, night, day, night, day, night. It is the infinity. So there is always something substantial, actual. Today, it's day. But the rhythm of the succession of day, night, is infinite. So it is potential, but in this potentiality, there is something actual. And I think that Leibniz is in this direction. And I think that Descartes is not interested in that. The second point of your question is about the creation of the eternal truth.
The contingency of mathematical
yes,
truth, because that's very radical.
I think that we have to think that the question is not that the mathematical truths are contingent. It's not the point. The point is to say, how could I be sure that my rationality is grounded? The mathematical truths are not suspended in the sky. They are the structure of our reason. So what is important for Descartes is to give a root to our reason. And he says, if God has not created our reason, who created our reason? Nothing. So I'm not sure of my reason. If I want to my reason to be rooted, to be grounded, I have to think that my reason is created by someone who does not lie. and my reason equals mathematical truth.
First of all, I disagree with you about Leibniz, but this is for another discussion. But as for your first question, by the way, it's an interesting question whether really Leibniz, we know it from Leibniz that he did the distinction between truths of fact and truths of necessity or logic. And what you spoke about, the contingency of mathematics, is indeed, did Descartes believe that God could create another world in terms of different mathematics does not apply? I don't know. I don't think that Descartes really referred to this question ever. I think it's indeed an innovation by Leibniz, isn't it? He didn't say that God could really create another world in which mathematics would be different or logic would be different. It didn't say it explicitly, at least, right?
He doesn't say.
So basically, Professor Arbib is the expert, but I think that Descartes is not only the source of our evidence or our certainty of in our truths, in our epistemic truths, but also the source of truth, the objective truths. And therefore, the question is to where does this maxim go? I mean, could God create a different world with different physics? Yes. Could God create a different world with different mathematics? I think he would agree with Leibniz at the end of it, or even if he doesn't speak about it.
For Descartes, the question of which truth he's dealing with is a question. We don't know.
Objective or subjective?
No, physical or mathematical.
Okay.
Sometimes the truth, sometimes moral truth, mathematical truth. It's difficult. But we even can think that he could have created other truth, but we cannot think this truth.
Of course, that's true.
Because we cannot think 2 + 2 = 5. It's not thinkable.
Of course. And as for your first question, of course, Professor Arbib's answer is good enough, but I would add another aspect. Perfection, when you speak about infinity of the number line, in mathematics, you actually speak about one aspect of infinity, which is size, measurement. Now, when Descartes speaks about perfection, he speaks about perfection in all its aspects, meaning infinite wisdom, infinite goodness, infinite, everything is infinite, not just the size. Size even is more problematic because size refers to matter, yes, of course, and to the extending, not to other aspects. So, in some respects, Descartes is less interested in this concept of perfection. He's less interested in the mathematical aspects of infinity because it's more to the physical world, but he's more interested in goodness, wisdom, and other attributes of infinite wisdom, infinite goodness, and other aspects of perfection.
Okay, please join me. And
I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm a teacher in mathematics, and it arose a question. Because I was thinking about Cartesian geometry and infinity. He had this idea to take a point, it's infinitely small. Instead of this point lost in the infinity of the space, he had this idea to fix the limits and to make the axis and to give two numbers for it. So I was thinking that also in this aspect, he could understand how to use this rationality to fix limits to space infinity, because it was genius to translate the geometry in the space and to make it in a system of axes, very concentrated and very not so afraid.
Because
just I was thinking because it's my profession.
maybe I could answer in French because I guess that you understand. Dans l'espace d'Aristote était différencié. L'espace de Descartes n'est plus différencié. Donc il faut introduire de la différence. Entre deux objets, ce qui va être décisif, c'est le rapport. Descartes dit, et on le voit, si je suis dans un bateau, que je me déplace, je peux dire que c'est le bateau qui quitte ou bien que c'est le port qui s'en va. Le mouvement est toujours relatif. Donc il a besoin d'un axe pour créer de la différence dans l'indifférencié. He creates difference in space which has no difference. Et ça, c'est le support de sa géométrie.
How could we finish this without a bit of French? So please join me with.
May I
with- oh, yeah, answer,
Just,
sure.
for one thing, I think you hit the right point, and that is actually the concept of the graph in analytic geometry is actually based on the idea that you give a function and you can draw the function in a limited space, but then you understand the concept of extrapolation, which goes to infinity. Actually, it fits more to the Aristotelian concept of infinity rather than what is more problematic, and this is another point that you hit, is the concept of the infinitesimal, that's infinitely small point or size, which becomes the great mathematical question of the generation after that in Leibniz and Newton, and that's another question.
Okay, so now please join me in thanking our speakers, and hope to see you in future events here at the Leer.
תודה, אבויה. תודה לך. Thank you very much.